Hey there, Robert John Hadfield here with Audio Mover, and I want to do something kind of different today. I was in Denver, Colorado recently, and I went to one of my favorite places, which is Wax Trax. It's kind of it's a record store, and I've been going to it since I was a kid. And they have this huge collection of used records and new records, but the used stuff is really fun to dig through. And they also have a wall of cassette tapes, and I was just doing what I do, and I looked through this stuff, and I found this Whitesnake tape, and I opened it up, and I looked inside, and a lot of tapes that are produced by record companies were sealed shut, they were glued shut, and this particular one has screws, and where you can actually open it up. And so I thought it'd be fun to buy this and actually show you what these tapes look like on the inside, and then also talk about Whitesnake, which was one of my favorite bands back in the 1980s. And they have such an interesting, Whitesnake has such an interesting history because they were part of that family tree that kind of built out of Deep Purple. And so, because David Coverdale, who was the singer for Whitesnake, the first time most of us ever heard of him was when he replaced Ian Gillan in Deep Purple. And then they put out this album, the song Burn, which a lot of people are familiar with from the Deep Purple days, especially days when David Coverdale was in there, and it was such an amazing song. And then David Coverdale, who was with Deep Purple then, left Deep Purple and then started this band called Whitesnake. And then they went on to have a whole bunch of hits. And where you would have heard of them, especially in the 1980s, was they had the song Here I Go Again. And it came out in 1987. Here I go again on my own. Everybody's heard that song before. It was just one of those huge, huge hits back in the 1980s. And it was on the album right before this one. This album is called Slip of the Tongue. And interestingly, the song that I was just saying, Here I Go Again, came off of, what a lot of people don't know is that Here I Go Again, when it came out in 1987 on what was in essence a self-titled album called just Whitesnake, that was not the first time that song was released. That song actually was released many, many years earlier on another album called Saints and Sinners. And it didn't go anywhere. It didn't do anything. And then they re-released it in 1987. And then, of course, it became this just massive, massive hit. I mean, still, that song is still kind of one of the touchstone songs from the 1980s. I mean, anyway, it was such a big deal. And so that was on in 1987. That was on Whitesnake, kind of had a self-titled album, and that's where they put out Here I Go Again, famous music video with Tawny Katane in it, and then it just sold like crazy. I mean, it was huge, huge hit. Adrian Vandenberg played the guitar solo on that song, on that album, but John Sykes, who had been on the previous album, which was Slide It In, which is what, okay, I don't want to get, I'm going to get carried away with this because I'm so fascinated by this history of the way it all worked, but Slide It In, which came out in 1984, that's where I first really heard of Whitesnake. I showed up to school one day, and they had apparently, they were on tour, I'd never heard of them, and I saw all these people wearing these T-shirts for Whitesnake, and all of a sudden, who is this? And so then I go buy the album Slide It In, and it just, Slide It In, the song, Slow and Easy, and then Love Ain't No Stranger, which is the third song on that album, which is just one of my favorite Whitesnake songs ever. Anyway, that album, Slide It In, was so good. And then when they came out with that next album that had the song Here I Go Again on it, which was kind of, again, they kind of just came out in 1987 with that self-titled Whitesnake album that had that. They still had John Sykes playing on it from the previous album, Slide It In, but they had Adrian Vandenberg, who was with the band Vandenberg, come in and play the guitar solo. Sorry, I get carried away with this stuff. He played the guitar solo, and then on the next album, which is this one, this is why I'm doing this, Adrian Vandenberg was now, John Sykes was gone, and Adrian Vandenberg became the full-time guitar player. But then Adrian Vandenberg, because of an injury, didn't actually play on this album. It was Steve Vai who then came in, because David Coverdale basically just picked up these two guitar whizzes, Adrian Vandenberg and Steve Vai. Anyway, so Steve Vai then plays all the songs in this album. Now, why am I going through all this stuff? Because this album had a song on here, and you can see it right there. Hopefully you can read it. It's called Fool for Your Loving. So on the previous album, which was called Whitesnake, like I said, it was self-titled, they put on the song Here I Go Again, which was taken off of an album that had been released several years earlier called Saints and Sinners, and they had this huge hit re-recording the album, or re-recording that song. Well, I think they hoped that they would be able to accomplish the same thing with this song Fool for Your Lovin', because Fool for Your Lovin' actually came off of an album called Ready and Willing, or Ready and Willin', which had come out several years earlier on a previous Whitesnake album. So the song Fool for Your Lovin' on this album, Slip of the Tongue, was a redone song, kind of like Here I Go Again. And they were hoping to accomplish that same thing, that massive, lightning in a bottle kind of thing, by re-releasing an old Whitesnake song on this album too, but it didn't obviously do what the other one did. And it's funny, I'll show you, it's so hard to read these little cassette tapes. Cassettes were so interesting this way, it's so tiny. But you can see right here, you probably can't read it, I'll read it to you. David Coverdale vocals, Steve Vai guitar, Adrian Vandenberg guitar, Rudy Sarzo bass. Rudy Sarzo, see, he's picked up all these famous people from the 1980s. Rudy Sarzo, where you had originally heard of him, would have been on Quiet Riot. And he kind of just became this well-known bass player. And then Tommy Aldridge on drums, and he was known, I think he played with Ozzy. And anyway, all these guys kind of made it through the heavy metal circuit back in the day. I saw Steve Vai, where I was first introduced to him. He played in a band called Alcatraz, and I saw Alcatraz play in a place called Rainbow Music Hall back in Denver, Colorado. This is before most people had heard of him, and I barely knew who he was. And he was, that was when Graham Bonnet was singing with Rainbow. Sorry. Graham Bonnet had been with the band Rainbow, and then he went off and joined Alcatraz. And Alcatraz originally had Yngwie Malmsteen playing guitar. Anyway, there's so much history in all this stuff, and I think it's so interesting. But Adrian Vandenberg, and it says here in this tiny, tiny, tiny writing, even though Adrian Vandenberg's listed here as a guitar player, he didn't actually play on any of this. It was all Steve Vai. So Adrian Vandenberg, who's known as the guitarist for Whitesnake, the only thing he really played on prior to this was the guitar solo on Here I Go Again, which was a re-recorded song from a previous Whitesnake album, and all he did was the solo, and so that was Adrian Vandenberg's involvement. I actually loved Adrian Vandenberg because he had another band called Vandenberg. They only had one kind of sort of hit called Burning Heart, and I think that's what it was called. Anyway, Vandenberg had 3 albums, and I bought all of them. This burning heart of mine, it still hurts after all this time. You probably don't even remember that. It was a kind of a hit, and then they put out 2 more albums after that, and they didn't really go anywhere. But anyway, the original recordings of these songs, Fool for Your Lovin' and Here I Go Again, had Mick Moody and Bernie Marsden. They were the original guitar players. Then when they re-recorded it, he had these superstar guitarists that worked on them. So anyway, I'm going to open this thing up so you can see what it looks like. Like I said, a lot of albums or a lot of tapes that were put out by record companies, like Whitesnake was on Geffen, And let's see if oh yeah, there it is right there, Geffen. They weren't put in these nicer cases. They were these, you probably remember, they were, a lot of times they were white and they were just glued together, sealed shut. They're kind of cheaply made. This was a little nicer, a little higher quality tape, and that's what made me interested when I saw this at Wax Trax. I thought, oh, this would be fun to make a video and just kind of open it up. I haven't opened it up yet, but I can see from the outside what's going on in there. And they do something kind of interesting here where a lot of your cheaper tapes, everything was there were just basically two pieces of plastic that stick together. This one has this whole extra thing on the inside, and I'll show you, that's holding the pressure pad in place. A lot of tapes have this, well, all tapes have this, but a lot of tapes, this pressure pad falls off over time. You can see this piece of felt, I'll show you right there underneath it, that thing right there. That piece of felt is a really, really important thing if your tape is going to play correctly. Because when you push play on a cassette tape, what happens is the head that reads the magnetic signal, literally when you push play, pushes in like this. And in this case, it's kind of neat because you can see it from the side. And you'll see that that little piece of that felt, which is mounted on this little piece of thin, very thin copper, moves in it because it gives a little bit. And what happens is the tape goes in, or the head goes in and pushes on it. And then as the tape spins, that's what gives a really solid connection between the tape and the tape head. This is not a tape head, these are tweezers, but it's shaped a little bit like that. And then then when you push stop, it disengages, but that little pad right there is a very, very important part of the tape sounding good. And a lot of people will have tapes that they'll send in here to the studio. We get a lot of tapes from churches, government agencies, things like that are recorded, and what happens is we'll get them. They get shipped in from all over the country, and they've been a lot of times sitting for 30 years or more, and that little piece of felt just kind of falls off because the adhesive just wears out over time, and then the thing falls off, and then when you play it, it doesn't sound as good because it's not getting a solid connection. So anyway, I'm going to show you what this looks like on the inside. Hopefully you'll find this kind of interesting, but there's usually, most tapes will have 5 screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 4 in the corners and then 1 that sits right over there. And they're usually, not always, but most of the time, if it has screws, they're little Phillips screws. I think it was the brand BASF that had flathead screws. And you can always tell side A or side 1 because, except in rare occasions, that's the side that the screws are on. You can see this is side 1. That's the side where the screws are. So I'm taking out all 5 of these. And then what happens when you take those out, this should just lift right off very easily. And there you go. Just lifts right off. And then there's the tape on the inside. Now, then also you'll see that there's this little gasket right there. And it's kind of hard to tell. You should be able to see it, though. You can see that there's this little, kind of a little embossing, kind of these, in this case, there's these 2 kind of raised lines right there and right there. And the reason they do that was, if we flip this back over, and you'll see that it's even on this other side right here, this raised line. When the tape is spooling, turning, it keeps it a little nicer, a little flatter. And tapes that don't have that embossing on this gasket, you'll see that these ridges are a little more emphasized. It doesn't spool on quite as smooth. Those little ridges give that just a little bit of extra pressure. This gasket keeps the tape from rubbing on the plastic, so then it rubs on this gasket. But then those little raised embossed areas on the top and the bottom make sure that the tape spools on nice and smooth. And then then this is, again, what it looks like on the inside. I'm going to lift this out so you can kind of see what this looks like, the tape, without the tape in it. They just, and again, they just kind of sit there. This is raised, and it fits the inside of the spool here. And most tapes, not all, but most of the time they have what's called leader tape right here. There's nothing that can be recorded on there. You can actually see it's, in this case, it's transparent. Sometimes it's white. It can be a lot of different colors, but it's just this little piece of plastic that then it attaches to the oxide tape, and I'll show you here. And they usually just have this little piece of adhesive that you can see on this side right here, and then the leader is connected then to the actual audio tape right there. And so that's the other thing. This is basically, for all intents and purposes, just a piece of tape, literal tape, like adhesive tape. And similarly, over time, that'll wear down, kind of like a piece of Scotch tape. If you've seen a piece of Scotch tape that's been sitting for 20, 30 years, it'll just come apart, it'll come off, and the same thing will happen here eventually. But this is actually held up really well. A lot of these higher quality tapes will hold up for a long, long time. And then the brown tape right here is where the actual audio signal is found. And so, and it's this side right here, the tape, the head will actually read that right there. And then that's what gets sandwiched between the head and the pressure pad. Anyway, so that's how that works right there. And you can see there's about a foot, a little over a foot of leader tape that's there. And it's usually enough so that it spools all the way around on top of itself on the one side. You can see how they did that right there. And then, again, there's this gasket that sits right there. And like I said, it's on both sides. And they both have this little ridge. Now, this is what's kind of interesting about this particular tape. A lot of these things just have, this is all part of the actual plastic. But in this case, they have a whole nother unit, this whole other piece that then fits on top of that little protrusion. I don't know what you call that right there, but that little post that's part of the plastic injection mold. And then this is a whole separate piece. This is not, most of the tapes you buy, like the old TDKs and Maxells, most of them they were not built this way. This is a little bit different animal. And as a result, this pressure pad sits in here a little differently. And I'm going to, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pause this for a second because I want to go get an actual pressure pad so you can see what it looks like if I were to remove it. I'm not going to do that right here because it's kind of, well, maybe I will. The way this works is you can see that there's these little metal posts right here that are basically holding that pressure pad in place. And I'm going to go grab a pressure pad. I'm going to pause this for a second so you can see what it looks like when it's removed. All right, so I just grabbed a pressure pad so you can kind of see what it looks like in there. So this would just sit right in that spot right there. And in this case, normally it just sits there, and when you close the tape up, it just kind of floats in there and it sits in between two little posts. In this case, what they've done with these is they've kind of locked them in there with these pieces of metal. And these pieces of metal you can see are pushed in through these little holes right there that are part of the plastic. I want to see if I can get those out. I'm probably never going to play this tape, so it won't really matter if we take it apart. Let's see here if I've got a small enough screwdriver on hand to do this. So you can kind of see, I need a smaller one. Well, I didn't bring anything small enough to push. Oh, there we go. So you can see right there, this little piece of metal, you can just take it right out, like so. And then when it comes out, then you can see that this pressure pad that's on this mount then can be removed. And what happens is sometimes when these pressure pads fall off, you don't have to open it up like this. You can actually just get another pressure pad and glue it on top of the little copper, that little piece of copper. So I'm going to push this back in. Okay, so now you can see how that works though. Get an idea of how that whole thing functions. Normally, and the reason I want to show you this is different. This is not how these things are usually put together. But anyway, it's kind of interesting how that happens and how that works. And so then, and so again, if you needed to, if that fell off, you could theoretically take this out and then remove those little posts and then just set that in place. And because these pressure pads are normally very, very universal. They'll kind of fit in any tape. You can take it out of one and put it in another. And the other thing is, there you'll see this, there's also this little piece of metal, and this is a little magnetic shield, and it sits right there. And these also normally just kind of float in place. And anyway, it's a little magnetic shield because the playhead, of course, there's a magnetic field being generated when it's recording onto the tape, and when you're recording onto the tape, there's a magnetic shield being generated to record onto the tape, and there's a little thing called an erase head, and I'll have to show you that sometime. So as you're recording onto a tape, it's not only putting a magnetic signal onto the tape, it's also erases the tape as it goes across. Anyway, that's a whole nother... It erases the tape before it records onto the tape. If you ever record it onto a tape, there's actually two heads. There's an erase head and a play head. And what happens is it'll actually go through the process of erasing whatever's on the tape before it records onto the tape. If you didn't have the erase head, every time you record on a tape, it would just keep adding onto it. And so the erase head actually cleared off the tape before you recorded onto it. And it all did it in one little movement. Anyway, but the point is, there's a little magnetic field that's being generated right there, and you don't want that magnetic field interacting with the actual oxide tape that's you can see right next to it. And so this little piece of metal blocks that magnetic field that's being generated so that it doesn't impact. It only impacts the tape that's right in front of it instead of impacting the tape that's over there. Anyway, that's generally the idea. So then when we put this tape back in, you'll see that it runs around these posts. Hopefully I'm not running out of time, getting close. It runs around these posts right here, from one spool to the other. And I'll show you one other thing that's kind of interesting. This post, these reels right here actually come out too. And they sit around these little posts that are also part of the plastic injection mold. And they actually spin freely. They help the tape, they help the tape move smoothly through the mechanisms. So anyway, sometimes this can be a little bit of a challenge getting this back lined up. Hopefully it won't be in this case. Because what kind of starts to happen is the tape will move out, and then when you're trying to put this back over the top of it, it'll end up on the outside of these. You'll see right here, these pieces of plastic. The tape's supposed to be on the inside of that. And when you're putting this back together, sometimes the tape will find itself, it'll start moving out as you're working with it, and then it'll end up on the outside of those, which is not what you want. So now I'm going to put this back on. And fortunately, the gasket is kind of sticking to the inside of that. Otherwise, I would just set the gasket on top of it before I closed it. So then you just kind of set this back on. You can see right there that the tape wants to come on the outside again. Let me pull a little bit tighter. I'm going to set that down. There you go. And then that seals back up. And then we put these screws back in. And it'll just function normally as it did before. But anyway, it's kind of interesting to see how that stuff is all put together on the inside. And in this case, it's, like I said, it's a little bit different because most tapes on the inside don't have that separate piece. They're usually, it's all just one piece that the pressure pad sits inside of and the magnetic shield. And I was such a big fan of these guys. David Coverdale was such an amazing singer. And when Ian Gillan left Deep Purple, that was all before my time, but Deep Purple was such a classic band. And then the history of these groups is so interesting, watching how people kind of moved from band to band, and it made this really interesting family tree that built off of Deep Purple. And I mean, it went into, David Coverdale went off and started Whitesnake, and then you heard all the names that got involved with that. And then Richie Blackmore went off and formed Rainbow. And then, of course, you had people like Ronnie James Dio that was in Rainbow, and Joe Lynn Turner and Graham Bonnet, who I mentioned earlier. So then that went off that way. And then Dio, of course, went off on his own and did all things. And Ronnie James Dio ended up singing for Black Sabbath. And Ian Gillan, who used to sing for Deep Purple, he ended up going off and singing for Black Sabbath. And then of course, Black Sabbath and Ozzy, and then Ozzy went off and all the different people, and then Ozzy had all these I mean, it's just fascinating, all these connections that just kind of built off on this family tree. And Whitesnake was kind of in the middle of it all. And they were this huge band back in the 1980s, and I absolutely loved them. And David Coverdale, one of the just classic great singers from that era. I mean, what a just amazing, amazing voice that guy had. And you go back into those days with Deep Purple and the song Burn, which is just one of my all-time favorite Deep Purple songs. And if you've never listened to it, go listen to it. And Ian Pace, who is the drummer. So Ian Pace and John Lord, who played in Deep Purple, the original Deep Purple stuff with Ian Gillan. Well, when David Coverdale left and formed Whitesnake, Ian Pace, I hope I said that right. Ian Pace, who is the drummer for Deep Purple, went with David Coverdale into Whitesnake, and so did John Lord. John Lord, who is the organ player. Thanks for joining me. Of course, be sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and like the video and share any comments. If you have any memories of this stuff, I'd love to hear about it. Anyway, with that, have a fantastic day.